Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share my chunky horseshoe wire chain design. Now I'm using large hole metal beads with wire to create this. It's a repetitive design. Once you get the technique, you can make acres and acres of the stuff if you really want to, but it's a beautiful way to use up large hole metal beads, and it's a really simple technique. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I'll show you the design a little more closely. So I have a selection of large hole metal beads encrusted with rhinestones in varying colours, and I've used them with some 18 gauge or 1mm wire to create quite a substantial chunky horseshoe chain design. It's a little bit like a bicycle chain in so much as you can make it as long or as short as you need it to. And I've even created a very simple clasp, which you could obviously use a slightly different design for the clasp if you wanted to, but this is just to show you that you can use the same technique to create something with just a handful of lengths of wire, a hammer and block, and some large hole beads. So it is really nice on the wrist. You can definitely feel that you're wearing it. It's a good chunky piece, even though you're not working with the heaviest wire in the world. So I have already pre-cut 12 lengths of wire. Let's just sneak that up into the top corner. And there we go. I've pre-cut 12 of these lengths of wire, and I'm going to use some simple tools to create a bunch of horseshoes. So what I'm looking for is a bowl of these. 11 pre-formed like this and hammered. We'll have the beads put onto them, and a 12th one will be used to create that extra simple clasp. As I said, you can change the clasp design if you wish to. So let's get forming. Each of these lengths of wire measure 55mm or 2 1/8 inches, and the gauge of wire is 1mm gauge, or that's equivalent to 18 gauge. Now my first tool is a lip gloss. Now you might find something that is like a rod which is similar to this if you have something available. The diameter across is 16mm. So all I'm going to do to begin with is to just form those lengths of wire, all 12 of them, around like so. Just remove that lip gloss out of the way, and the ends are just slightly narrower than the width across whatever rod you use to form that design. It's a very simple technique. If your wire's a little bit kinked, you might want to just warm that through slightly. So I'm just going to get some heat into that wire and then form it around whatever piece I have to hand. So this is just a very inexpensive lip gloss that happens to be 16mm in diameter. So I've got my first two there. What you'll notice is that's not completely centralised. So I often make one of those that's slightly off. If that happens to you, you can take the slightly longer side over just a little bit more and bring the slightly shorter side out a little bit more until you get that circular form centralised. So the next thing you're going to need to do is bring in your block and hammer. Now I've got a lovely simple chasing hammer, anything that's got a nice flat smooth surface, and I've got a mini block from our friends at Impress Art here. So what I'm going to do is just hammer around about 3/4 of the wire, starting in the centre, and I'm going to leave these end sections. Each of those are about sort of 8mm or so I'm going to leave unhammered. Now the way that I tend to do this is to hold that down with my 2 fingers, not completely at right angles but close to right angles, because you're less likely to strike your fingertips if you hold the wire thusly. So let's just hammer one of these and then we'll move on to the next stage. So you can see that I have these end sections which are completely unhammered. They will be slightly harder anyway, due to the fact that the work hardening you're doing on this section kind of travels along towards the end pieces of the copper. So I'm going to repeat that another 11 times so that I have 12 pieces of wire in this form. So I've created myself 12 identical forms in the shape of a horseshoe, but they're only very gently tapered at the top. They're not very close together. It's just a very slight incline on those top angles. So if you wanted to, you could create a whole bunch of these, take them with you to craft fairs or wherever people are likely to interact with you and talk to you about your jewellery making. You could have your large hole beads at the ready and you can custom create on the fly. It's a really lovely, again, quite a mindful design to just do all that piecework in advance, and then when the moment takes you, you can create some beautiful horseshoe chain. So if you join me back down at the board, I'll show you the next stage of the technique. So I have my pot of large hole beads and I have my small tray of at least 12 of those horseshoe forms, which have all been hammered around the middle sort of 75% or so. So what we need to do is grab a bead and grab one of our horseshoe forms. And we're just going to slide the first one on. Now these beads happen to have a direction, so there's a short end and a long end. So I'm going to pop one of those onto my first horseshoe form to begin with. And then what we're going to do is turn some very teeny tiny loops on the ends of the horseshoe. Now for the first bead, you can actually do that before you put it on. But after that, you need to be working with the horseshoes in their raw form. So let's just grab a hold of one of those ends, and I'm going to use the very, very tip of my round nose pliers, and I'm going to rotate those around until I have a loop that touches the wire. So you can see the very cut end of the wire is touching the pass of wire underneath, and I'm going to repeat on the other side. These need to be moving in the same orientation. So let's just turn that wire over until it reaches back and touches the path of wire before it. And then I'm going to grab hold of my bent chain nose pliers and just straighten these two loops up. So you can see where the horseshoe tapers in slightly. I want to bring these two loops to parallel so that they are sat like train tracks, even though there's a gentle incline on those sides of the wire. So we're going to grab our next horseshoe and our next bead. If your beads have an order, or a direction rather, I want these to all face the same way. You'll need to be mindful of that. So we'll take the next horseshoe and pop it through the first loop. And then I'm going to just sit that in position and add my bead on to the design like so. What I then need to do is retract that wire back through and allow it to pass through the second loop on the other side of that horseshoe. Now if you've made these tiny and tight, it can be just a tiny bit fiddly to drag it through, which is why I suggest using around about a 16mm form just to get those wires nice and curvy, but not too curvy. There we go. It does come through, and that's one of the reasons I like to hammer them, because you might need to just pull that a little bit more firmly. If you don't hammer them, then your chain won't have the residual strength to keep its formation. So the next thing we're going to do is create those loops again. From here on in, you will only be able to create the loops after your wire has passed through the bead. So I'm going to turn the wires in the same orientation. So if you look at the preceding loop, it turns upwards in this orientation. So I need to ensure that my loops turn the same way again. And that just keeps the chain nice and flat and even. You'll get a slightly different look if you do it the other way. And if you do it the other way, don't worry, it will just look a little bit uneven. I like to keep them all moving in the same direction. So those loops again are as tiny as I can make them. They're on opposite sides, opposite ends. And the next thing we're going to do is just straighten them up again so that they sit parallel. And that makes it as easy as possible for you to get the wire through for the subsequent bead loading. So we're going to grab another one of those large hole beads and make sure it's sitting in the correct orientation if they have an orientation. I'm going to load the bead on, retract the wire back through and push that through the second loop. And then it is basically a case of repeating until you have almost the right length that you need. So if I just pop this down for a second, in a moment off camera I will add another 8, I can't count today, so I've got 11 in total. If I have 11 of these in a great big long strand, It's just the right length for my wrist, so you might need to go through the process, try that on for size and see if you need greater or fewer than the 11 beads I've suggested. So I've continued adding all 11 of my large hole beads in the same fashion, and what I've ended up with is quite a lumpy chain, and if you've followed the instructions so far, you've probably got quite a lumpy chain too. Don't be disheartened, because at the next stage of the technique I'm going to show you how to get that to sit more evenly. So let's head back down to the board and continue on our merry way. So this is my finished chain that I prepared before the video, and this is the chain as I have just made it. So you can see it's all a little bit kinked and all a little bit higgledy-piggledy. One thing I didn't anticipate is having a much wider bead has made the technique a little bit tricky. So the narrower beads with that 6mm or large hole aperture are ideal. The wider they are, you're probably going to need a couple of extra beads for the same kind of overall length. However, to turn this into this, all we need to do is spend a little bit of time squishing. And I do love a bit of good squishing with wire. So what we're going to do is apply pressure inwards, like so. You may prefer to wear gloves for this if you have sensitive fingertips. Or you can sometimes use a pair of pliers to help. If you've got some large nylon jaw pliers, that's ideal. But what we need to do is just squish that horseshoe so that it's slightly narrower across. And every time we take a link and we give it a bit of a squish and we bring those little loops that we made sit almost inside that large drill aperture. Every time you take a second to just straighten things out and push that closer towards its finished finish, that's not a particularly good way of explaining it, but towards its final destination, as it were, it gets just a little bit easier to handle. You can see how the chain is already sitting flatter at this end, whereas the one we haven't worked on is all a little bit higgledy-piggledy. It is a little bit tough on the fingers, so do feel free to use gloves or grab a piece of cloth to help you. Just get that to sit centralised in the bead and then just squish as you go. And it's quite satisfying to see the difference between the before and the after as you move along. The more time you spend at this stage, the nicer your finished chain will look. So I'm just going to continue all the way along to the end. And it doesn't take too much. A little bit of fingertip effort to just bring that to a slightly nicer conclusion. So you can see that for the same number of beads with that large hole, the same lengths of wire, my piece with the narrower holes, not the narrower breadth across the bead, is actually just that little bit longer. So my advice would be to choose beads that are slightly narrower, like these beautiful large hole spacer beads, than these gorgeous wide beads. I would just need to add a couple more links to make this work for my wrist size. So as you may remember, we prepared 12 horseshoes and 11 beads. So this is where we've got to now. So to complete our clasp in the simplest possible way, what I'm going to do is make sure that these two loops that we created on that last link are really, really strong. And I'm just going to give them a squish with my pliers to ensure that they're as neat and tidy as possible. And then I'm going to make that last horseshoe form, making sure it's centralised until it sits almost closed. You will need to just change the angles on those two loops until they can sit flush side by side. So I've made the world's simplest clasp here. And to do that, I'm going to turn around a slightly larger hole on one of those ends. So I'm just going to use my round nose pliers to bring that all the way around. And as that's going to be quite a functional piece, you might like to just hammer that before you add it in to your final piece of the jigsaw puzzle. I'm going to give it a really hearty squish with my pliers and then cautiously open up one side so that I can hook through both of those loops and then close back up. As I said, this is just a very, very simple clasp to work with this design. And then I'm just going to draw this around slightly, change that angle before I turn a loop on the other end. Now the loop on the other end does need to be relatively diminutive because it needs to go through that last hole at the other end of our bracelet design. So I'm going to turn quite a small loop over the end. If you wanted to use pliers and then let's just get a nice little loop shape going first. So we've got a loop shape there to begin with. What I will then do is give it a little bit of hardness, and then I'm going to squish it very, very carefully to just narrow that down slightly. So what I'd like to do ideally is just change the formation of this ever so slightly and ever so gently, because I've already hammered it, just to get that to sit exactly how I see fit. So because this has previously been hammered, you don't want to be too brutal with it. You do want to just take a few moments to get that to sit exactly centrally on the bead, and to make sure that you're happy with the length of your chain before you add this final touch. Now if you have got a large enough hole in your bead, you can simply slot that through and just draw it slightly more closely together so that you have a completed chain. Now as I mentioned, because these beads are wider across from side to side, it's made a slightly shorter chain than I anticipated. Probably will still fit my wrist, but this one is going to be so much more comfortable with those narrower beads. I hope that you have enjoyed making the horseshoe beaded chain with me today. I've certainly learnt a lot while I was doing it. Definitely better to use the slightly narrower beads with that at least 6mm drill hole, and metal beads are always going to be the answer for a design like this for strength and longevity. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.